Hi everybody, my name's Debbie Halbert and I am working with the Oahu Search and Rescue, a new organization trying to establish call-out qualified members for our different activities here on Oahu. As part of that process, we've developed a series of online videos to help us go through some of the basics that we need to know before going out in the field as call-out qualified members. The first of these online trainings is personal fitness, basic survival, and wilderness safety. The slides for this PowerPoint were made by the former OSAR president, Megan Huber, and they were derived from the National Association for Search and Rescue's Fundamentals of Search and Rescue manual. That manual covers all of the things that are needed to establish a SAR Tech 2 certification. While this particular PowerPoint does not go into the depth necessary to pass the SAR Tech 2 test, it does provide an overview of several of the material or chapters found in that particular manual. Specifically, information in this particular PowerPoint will cover chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. Of course, we have adapted it to Hawaii to some degree, and we are not covering all aspects of each chapter. I strongly encourage everybody to purchase a copy of Fundamentals of Search and Rescue and read through that book. Associated with this PowerPoint, there will be a brief online test for members of OSAR. And again, it does not reflect the longer test that would be necessary to pass SAR Tech 2 certification at the national level, but it will make sure that you followed through watching this PowerPoint through to the end. So let's begin. Part 1 is nutrition and fitness. At this point, we're beginning with the assumption that everybody has this basic kind of understanding, but it is good to make sure that we all are on the same page when it comes to things like nutrition and fitness. These are baseline qualifications for going out into the field, so it's nice to know that we're all starting from the same sets of assumptions. So why would physiology and fitness be important in talking about OSAR and its activities? This is a quote directly from the Fundamentals of Search and Rescue. SAR personnel must have a working knowledge of the necessities and priorities of life, human biological survival, including a fundamental understanding of issues related to nutrition, hydration, and thermoregulation. The chapters in the book go on to talk about why this is necessary. And I can say from personal experience that sometimes you go into a situation thinking that your climbing partner or your hiking partner understands some of these basics, only to find out later that they have not adequately prepared, they don't have sufficient water, or they haven't brought appropriate food or clothing. And all of these things can impact not only a successful search, but it can also contribute to your own potential problems in the wilderness. So yes, indeed, starting with some of these basics makes sense, even though we'd like to believe that everyone already knows these things. So starting with nutrition. Fundamentals of Search and Rescue says, what you eat today is what you run on tomorrow, which sounds like a fairly basic premise to begin with. We would like to emphasize at OSAR that you should not overlook meal planning. For some people, meals are very important and food is very important, and they can tell when they start to crash and they need to be ready with supplemental food for those moments. For other people, they can oftentimes forget to eat for long periods of time. I don't actually understand these people, but I hear that they exist. Additionally, as you're busy and moving through the wilderness, you oftentimes need to-go food more than you need sitting down and eating dinner kinds of food. So thinking through the kinds of healthy snacks you might need to get are important things to think about before you go out into the field. Specifically, what kinds of things do you find provide the best energy for you? How do you provide an adequate balance of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats? And we'll talk a little bit more about some of these basic items in terms of diet in a second. And finally, if you went to Google nutrition for firefighters, and you can do this and get some interesting related information, you would find that they have some variety of tips for you in terms of prepping for food. And of course, firefighters might be a good model because they engage relatively often in high energy activities, especially if they are wilderness firefighters. First, according to some of the websites you could look up for nutrition for firefighters, carbohydrates are important for food energy. Despite all of the high protein diets that are out there suggesting that you should cut carbs out, that's not true if you want to be performing at your peak while engaging in outdoor activity. Second, over long periods of time, good nutrition becomes even more essential so that you can avoid fatigue and muscle loss. So again, for a day or two, you may be able to eat less than you normally do or have just a snack here and there. But ultimately, if something were to go on in terms of search and rescue for more than a day or two, going on a week or more, you would begin to feel fatigue and muscle loss if you weren't adequately eating. And finally, third, and this is more my comment, not what firefighters would do, search and rescue is not a diet. So consuming the calories that you need to do the kind of work you need to do is pretty important. This is not a weight loss regime, so your calorie intake should be sufficient to keep you moving through all of the activities that are required. So be prepared with enough food. So let's talk a little bit about how many calories that might include. So if the basic bodily functions for everyday life require around 1,400 to 18 calories per day, that would just be a basic minimum, very much an average, and of course it varies from person to person. What do you need to do if you are going to engage in higher levels of activity? Well, this simple chart can help you do that. Take your gender, male or female, and then look to the level of activity, light, moderate, or heavy, and then use a calories per pound ratio to kind of get a sense for what kind of calories you ought to be consuming at one point or another. It's also worth mentioning that in cold climates, you may need to increase the calories per day over what you would consume in warmer climates. And so it's not always going to be the case that you would eat the same one way or another depending on climate. The major nutrient classes is something that we've covered probably all the time since grade school, but it's worth talking about briefly right here. There's 6 major classes of nutrients, life-sustaining substances, so to speak, that are found in food, or different kinds of food, I should say. Carbohydrates, proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, and water. In the following slide, I'll break down each of these major nutrients, though not spending too much time on vitamins and minerals. Again, those would be sort of baseline things that you would want to make sure that you were prepared with, and water we'll talk about a little bit separately. So water is recommended that everyone should drink between 6 to 8 ounce glasses a day. Again, this can be modified depending on your own personal levels and how much you drink, but as a general rule, it's good to stay hydrated. And again, we'll come back to this in a little bit. Proteins should consist of 12 to 20% of your caloric intake, approximately 50 to 70 grams depending on your body size. And proteins provide long sustained energy, but don't necessarily provide that immediate energy that carbohydrates or sugars do, which is why carbohydrates should make up 55 to 65% of your daily caloric intake and a minimum of 125 grams with an optimal of 350 to 400 grams. And finally, fats can provide the most concentrated form of energy and should consist of approximately 30 to 65 grams depending on caloric consumption, or 25 to 30% of caloric intake from fat, though you should of course avoid saturated fats. This can help provide a well-rounded diet for doing the kinds of activities necessary out in the field. And again, I know from personal experience that while proteins can help provide that base level of energy, if you begin to feel tired or fatigued, sometimes eating just a little bit can help raise your energy levels pretty significantly. Water and hydration are probably one of the most essential issues and concerns to be taken into consideration as you engage in any kind of outdoor activity, but especially when you're doing search and rescue. Not only is water essential for proper bodily functions, but humans can only survive a few days without water. That's something to keep in mind, of course, when engaged in a search for a lost person, but it's also something to keep in mind when doing any kind of outdoor activity yourself. On the slide, you see the quote, "When you feel thirsty, you are already dehydrated." And oftentimes people use that as a rule to describe why you ought to be constantly drinking water throughout the day. And of course, that's true. But it's not technically true that when you're thirsty, you're already dehydrated. When you begin to feel thirsty, what it indicates is that you've lost approximately 1% in terms of your normal water levels. And that's what triggers the thirst mechanism. So you should definitely pay attention to when you're thirsty, because it is an indication or a warning sign that the normal water levels in your body, whatever those may be, have begun to decrease. And of course, at the point that you begin to decrease them, you're going to want to remedy that situation as fast as possible. But to say that you're already dehydrated is a bit hyperbolic. It does, however, mean you should drink some water. If you have some interest in looking into this further, the Huffington Post ran an interesting article on information about dehydration not too long ago in 2013, and the link is here at the bottom of the page. But water and hydration is important because, of course, an inactive person may not burn through their water too quickly. It requires a minimum of 1.2 liters of water a day to keep all body systems functioning properly. For every 600 calories of heat the body generates, you can lose about 1 liter of fluid in the form of sweat. And so again, the thing to keep in mind is as you increase your exercise level and your energy output, you do need to always have access to water, and it's in order to keep your body running effectively. Dehydration can cause a lot of problems. So a couple different ways to check if you're dehydrated are shown in the slides on the right. One way is to check your urine. If it's clear, then you're doing fine. If it's golden, then you need to drink water. Another way, as you can see in the slide on the bottom, is to pinch the skin on the back of your hand. If your skin goes back to its original position without any problems, you're doing fine. However, if your skin stays up, as indicated in that picture, then you need to start thinking about drinking water. There are a variety of signs for dehydration that can include fatigue, cramping, headache, nausea, irritability, vomiting, and dizziness. A 10% drop in your water levels will impair your thinking and judgment, and 20% is a fatal level of dehydration. I can tell you from experience that thinking and judgment can be impaired when dehydrated, and give you a sense that you're making good decisions when in fact you're probably not. And also, it makes it much more difficult to eat food. In fact, it's almost impossible to eat food when you're dehydrated. So again, it has a cyclical effect in terms of dehydration and then food intake. If you are to encounter somebody in the field who is dehydrated or become dehydrated yourself, then you need to begin a process of rehydration. And there's some key points to think about when doing this. Slowly drinking water is an important aspect of rehydration, obviously, until the urine is a pale yellow. While rehydrating with water is acceptable, sports drinks can help with this, in part because they replenish the electrolytes that are lost via sweat, and they also, it turns out in surveys or studies, have shown that people will actually drink more if it's flavored slightly. Again, if you're out in the field and you have treated water, the electrolytes or the sports drinks or some kind of sports powder can overcome the taste of treated water. So it's a good idea to have some of this with you whenever you go. As a do not do, sometimes people will take salt pills or other kinds of salty substances in order to avoid the loss of salt in their bodies from sweat. If you are short on water, don't take any kind of salt supplements. So generally speaking, there's a few key points to remember about rehydration and water and dehydration. First, water is more essential than food, and a lack of it will kill you quicker than a lack of food. So always be prepared with water. I oftentimes not only hike with sufficient water for myself, but extra water for those that I might encounter. Second, it is impossible to perform at any reasonable level without the proper intake of fluids. It's essential for good activity to be able to be hydrated appropriately. Third, food should be eaten only when there's enough water to drink. Don't eat the food if water is scarce. And again, as I can tell you from personal experience, it's almost impossible to eat the food anyway. Fourth, consider the use of flavored sports drinks mixes to encourage fluid intake and to cover the taste of treated water. And finally, only use salt tablets with caution. Let's move on a little bit to body temperature regulation as another part of what's important for basic fitness and nutrition. The human body temperature should be somewhere around 99 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. And it's important to keep that at a regulated temperature in terms of equilibrium. The body's primary method of temperature regulation involves adjustments of the blood flowing between the core and the peripheries. And when the body gets colder, blood concentrates on the core functions of the body and moves away from the peripheries. Anyone who's spent any time outside in cold weather understands this quite well. But it's easy, of course, to become cold and or to become overheated, and so we'll be going through a little bit of both heat exhaustion, and then cold and hypothermia. So starting with the heat balance. When engaged in outdoor activity, adjusting the clothing system to control heat loss is pretty critical. It's one way that you can manage whether you're too cold or too hot. So as we'll talk about a little bit later when we talk about clothing, it's good to layer so that you can start cold, which is always a nice way to start, and then add layers if you need to, or take layers off if you need to. And that can help with the regulation of your body temperature that's necessary when outside. Heat is produced by the body through metabolism and muscle movement, and the heat must be dissipated to the clothing and then onto the environment if there's going to be some sort of constant core temperature maintained. And so again, starting cold is a good way to phrase that, because you want, as your body heats up, you don't want to be sweating into all of your layers of clothes. So it's something to think about as you move through any kind of outdoor activity. How sweaty are you going to be as you engage in that? And is there a way that you can regulate that through the clothing that you're wearing and in terms of the heat balance equation? Overheating happens, of course, if you don't regulate that well. So it's important for understanding both hot and cold environments, the ways that heat are transferred. There are 4 different kinds that we'll talk about here. First is radiation. Radiation is the heat that's coming off your body due to exercise. And so sometimes if you're standing next to somebody who's been engaged in heavy-duty physical activity, you can actually feel the heat radiating from their body. A second way in which we deal with heat and its transfer is conduction. This is more an issue in colder climates. So for example, when you sit on the cold ground, the body warmth that you have will be transferred out of your body, ultimately making you colder, and thus being aware of the conditions that you're in is important because the heat's conducted out of your body into parts of the environment that are colder. Anyone who's been sitting around on a metal bench on a cold day and knows what that feels like, to have the heat just sort of taken out of your body. The third kind of heat transfer is convection. Convection is heat that's lost from your body into the air. So here we can talk about wind chill, and we'll spend a little bit of time on wind chill in a second. But wind chill is when, even though the air temperature is a certain temperature, with the wind and its effect on your skin, it's actually much colder than the actual temperature says. And then finally is evaporation. This is often caused by humidity and heat discharged through sweat. It can be a significant heat loss method, and evaporation can occur in the form of what is called insensible perspiration, meaning that on a day that's not humid, you may not even notice that there is evaporation occurring. And this can cause you to lose up to 1.5 pints of moisture per day. Hence, again, why it's good to stay hydrated and pay attention to how you're feeling. So if you're overheating, some of the possible consequences include heat cramps, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke. And these can be very serious issues. So it's important to be aware of what the heat index might be for any humid day. The heat index is when the heat and humidity combined make it feel hotter than it actually is. Such conditions can be dangerous at higher temperatures especially. If you were to have heat cramps, heat exhaustion, or heat stroke, which can be life-threatening, it's important to work, and or if you encounter somebody with these conditions, it's important to cool them down. And so we'll talk a little bit about how you would cool the body in a humid area. One indication is this picture here, where you can tell that ice packs are being placed in areas where heat is especially likely to be emanating from the body. Cooling the body in a humid environment, when heat and humidity have combined, is important to ensure that you don't suffer from heat exhaustion or heat stroke. People who are suffering from these particular conditions may begin to appear disoriented and unable to function adequately. Liquids, including electrolytes, will be essential to rehydrating them and keeping them stable. Halting exercise is also important. If this is to happen in the field, seek to cool the individual down. However, and again, at the point that this becomes too severe, hospitalization and advanced medical treatment will be necessary. And so it's always good to keep an eye out for both yourself and your hiking partners or climbing partners or skiing partners or whoever you're spending outdoor time with, because you want to make sure that if they become disoriented and unable to function, you can adequately address what the problem is and stay ahead of it. Cold environments may not seem to be a problem in Hawaii, but as anyone knows who's been at higher altitudes, it can actually become significant, especially during the winter months, or if somebody is to become very wet and the conditions are wet and windy. As a general rule, dark colored clothing is better for cold environments, whereas light colored clothing is better for hotter environments because of the reflective capacity of white clothing and the absorptive capacity of dark colors. Wind chill is a factor to be considered on very windy days because wind chill, again, helps the temperature, which is the temperature of the air, feel much more significantly cold. And as the wind increases, it draws heat from the body, driving down skin temperature and eventually the core temperature. If this is to happen, and we talked about this a little already, as the blood vessels constrict to protect the core, peripheries are left kind of to their own devices, and shivering can begin. So one way to help with this, and again in terms of bioregulation, is to wear a hat. A lot of heat escapes through the head, and so keeping your head warm is a good way to retain body heat. It's also important, if you begin to feel cold and shiver, to engage in some kind of muscular activity to help raise the metabolic rate and to generate a little bit of energy. If an individual is to get too cold, then hypothermia can set in. And it is the case that hypothermia could happen in Hawaii because of low temperatures in the mountain, wind and rain, or if somebody is just in a lot of water. A severely hypothermic person needs to be immediately evacuated, if at all possible, and there needs to be advanced medical intervention. If it's mild hypothermia, then treating in the field to prevent additional heat loss is important. So one of the first signs of hypothermia is uncontrollable shivering. However, hypothermia can also affect decision making and may manifest itself as disorientation, apathy, or irritability. So again, it may be difficult to know that one of your partners is experiencing any kind of negative or debilitating effects. So it's important to kind of keep an eye on how people are feeling and whether or not they're acting the way they normally would. So when hypothermia sets into the body will try to protect the brain and central organs first and reduce blood flow to the extremities. Additionally, a person's core temperature has been impacted when suffering from hypothermia. So the best way to deal with the situation is to prevent further heat loss and gradually re-warm the individual. So one is re-warmed, depending on conditions, in a variety of different ways. So for example, if somebody's cold and hypothermic because of rain and wind, getting that person out of the wind and wet clothing is an important first step. One way you could warm somebody up in these conditions is to get them into a sleeping bag and warm them that way. And sometimes it may be useful or important for you to use your own body heat to help warm them up and get into that sleeping bag too. Using an emergency blanket, as shown in this picture, might be another way. If the hypothermia is mild, building a fire can also be a way to do that. Whatever you do, it is important to stop the hypothermia from continuing. Remember also that a person may not disclose that they're getting cold, and so the environment where hypothermia can be an issue requires everybody to pay attention to the people that they're working with. Shifting slightly to the issue of fitness. Fitness is an important part of Oahu Search and Rescue and really any kind of outdoor activity. One of the most important parts of this is being committed to being fit. You can't start exercising a couple days before an activity. This becomes a baseline for your life. And so OSAR members should consider engaging in some kind of physical fitness relatively regularly. You can decide what kind of activities you want to engage in, whether that's hiking or swimming or running or biking or all of the above, but you should be doing something to keep yourself physically fit. Again, one of the reasons that we have a PAC test is that you can demonstrate a level of physical fitness necessary to engage in the kind of work that Search and Rescue will do. The lack of conditioning and fitness has been repeatedly identified as one of the most common problems faced in the field by SAR personnel and managers. So a reasonable fitness level is necessary for optimal performance, especially in the field. And this is why we'll do the PAC test. And remember, there are places in Search and Rescue for everyone. And so be honest about your fitness level and your skills. Here are a few tips on how to look at fitness within the Search and Rescue paradigm. There are several different components of fitness: cardiorespiratory endurance, muscular strength, muscular endurance, and flexibility. Cardiorespiratory endurance is the ability to deliver oxygen and nutrients to tissues and to remove waste over sustained periods of time. Long runs and swims are among the methods employed in measuring this component. It's basically endurance. Muscular strength is pretty much what you think it is: the ability of the muscle to exert force over a brief period of time. So if we're going to measure upper body strength, it can be measured by various weightlifting activities. Muscular endurance is the ability of a muscle or group of muscles to sustain repeated contractions or to continue applying force against a fixed object. So a measure of muscular endurance are the number of push-ups somebody could do, and that would be measured specifically of arm and upper shoulder muscles. Flexibility, my least favorite. Flexibility is the ability to move joints and use muscles through their full range of motion. So a sit and reach test would be a good measure of flexibility for the lower back and the backs of the upper legs. And all of these are really essential to basic fitness for Search and Rescue, which means that some of us, myself included, need to work on our flexibility. In terms of workout schedules and minimal fitness requirements, the Fundamentals of Search and Rescue recommends the following basic fitness components: warm up for 5 to 10 minutes every workout, muscular strength, 2 20-minute sessions per week, muscular endurance, 3 30-minute sessions per week, a cardiorespiratory endurance, 3 20-minute sessions per week, flexibility, 10 to 12 minutes daily, and a cool down, 10 to 12 minutes after every workout. So you get a sense for about how much a basic level of fitness for Search and Rescue would be. I should also indicate that for our PAC test, for those of you who haven't heard about this yet, the intermediate that we use right now is a 2.5-mile course over somewhat rugged terrain, but relatively flat for Hawaii, in 45 minutes. And so carrying 20 pounds. So that's a good measure for whether or not your workout is meeting what you need to do. So to engage in the appropriate training, you should consider the following points. The specificity of the training. So train for what you'll be doing. If the goal is to be prepared for long hikes, then swimming may not be the best way to train. While it might help your overall fitness level, it's not going to train you specifically for the kinds of things that OSAR would do. Overload. To improve, you need to engage in workouts that will push your body beyond its normal state. Regularity. At least 3 balanced workouts a week are necessary. And if you follow this particular regime listed here, you may be working out more than 3 times a week. And progression. An increase in intensity, frequency, and or duration activity over time to improve is important. Finally, in terms of fitness, be ready to admit your limitations. Realistically assess your physical abilities, restrict your activities according to your actual fitness level, and be prepared. Being prepared physically involves also knowing your limits. And so that's an important thing to consider. It's okay to say, I need to stop and turn around, or that I'm not ready to do that intense a hike. It's important to know your limits and to not encounter those limits in the middle of a search. So let's move to part 2, survival for SAR. This is really chapter 6 in the fundamentals of search and rescue. And let me just read a brief quote from the beginning of that chapter. The ability to survive is infinitely more complex than merely being able to, quote, live off the land. Statistics show that nearly all survival situations today are short-term, 72 hours or less, as the more publicized long-term survival experiences comprise fewer than 5% of all incidents. To establish an effective, rational response to any survival situation, it is imperative to realize that actions and needs must be prioritized. Preconceived ideas about survival can precipitate actions when stressed, and the results can be fatal. First-hand accounts and interviews of survivors substantiate the fact that the decisions made in the first hours or minutes of an emergency have a great bearing on the ultimate outcome. And that's from page 56, if anyone wants to get the book and read it. So starting with a little bit of a basic. There's a general rule of 3s. The greatest obstacle, and again I quote here, an individual will have to overcome is an inappropriate mental attitude. So positive mental attitude, well, not really a 3, starts the list of the rule of 3s. So you could say, and this slide used to say before I edited it, 3 seconds without a positive mental attitude. But it really is more of an adaptability and up to you. But generally speaking then, 3 minutes without air, though I think I would not make it 3 minutes. 3 hours without a regulated body temperature, meaning shelter. 30 hours without rest, and these are at the extremes. Some people would not make it 30 hours. 3 days without water, again at the extreme. And 3 weeks without food. So that brings us to the following priorities to follow if you find yourself in need of surviving in the wilderness. First, a positive mental attitude. Second, air. The most scenarios that we'll be engaged with, air will be a constant. Third, shelter. Fourth, rest. Fifth, signals. Again, trying to get out of the situation. Sixth, water. And seventh, food. That's the list of priorities according to the fundamentals of search and rescue. To delve down into that a little bit more, surviving SAR selected thoughts from the book include these. The same environment that caused another person problems can also cause difficulty for you. So again, much of this presentation shifts between search and rescue personnel looking for a lost individual and then potentially what to do if you are the lost individual yourself. But certainly an environment that's caused a problem for one person may be difficult for you. And again, think about the kinds of high-angle hikes that exist in Hawaii and how that can affect any potential rescue. You can find yourself doing search and rescue work in unfamiliar terrain where all potential hazards are unknown. And while we train so that we can be better at adapting to these situations, it's still an important thing to remember in terms of survival. You can become lost or disoriented in unfamiliar areas, especially if you are unprepared in the first place. Again, one of the reasons we train is to make sure that we're as prepared as possible before engaging in any kind of search and rescue. Hazardous areas are some of the first areas to be searched. In your zeal to help others, you can also become a victim if you aren't careful. So again, as we think through where we go, we need to make sure that we plan appropriately before heading out. First, notice information is often vague. The severity magnitude of a SAR incident is often misrepresented or misjudged. SAR personnel are quick to venture into situations with less information than is necessary for safe operations. And finally, incident of injury in SAR operations is high. This may be due to poor preparation, adrenaline poisoning, misdirection by incident managers, or a number of intrinsic problems related to SAR operations. These are all things to keep in mind as we move through both our training regimes and if we ever engage in an actual search and rescue. In terms of comfort zones in Hawaii, everyone has these particular comfort zones. And the best way to prepare is to look for opportunities to expand your comfort zones into areas that you're unsure of now during training. During field exercises, it's an excellent time to try this, so that if we are deployed in the field, you'll know where your comfort zones are, and you'll also know where to stop. So be prepared to stop before you get over your head. So notice the guy right here. Not everybody's going to want to go up there, and it's important to be able to acknowledge that and say, that's fine, I'll let someone else do it. The first key here is in controlling your mind. I'm going to talk a little bit about fear. Controlling fear. As an individual approaches comfort zone limits, anxiety begins to grow. So if you start to feel like you're outside of your comfort zones, you're going to start moving towards a state of fear. If that is not controlled, it can become overt fear. And fear and panic, which is associated with fear, can lead to a loss of reasoning and, of course, make it much more difficult to perform or function. So one way to counteract that particular fear is training, knowledge, and experience that's gained from simulating emergencies, which helps to reduce the unknown, which is another reason why we train, and I hope everyone will engage in the training with us. But it is important to know that fear is a natural phenomena. I like to say that when people tell me they have a fear of heights, that's a natural fear. But you don't want that fear to so consume and control you that it incapacitates you. Managing fear in others, though, is an important part of what can happen within the SAR world, both for people who are lost, if we were to find them, but also for people on your own team who may be moving outside their comfort zone. At this point, again, demonstrating good procedures and a positive mental attitude are key. Accept individuals' limitations, that's important. Don't vilify them for them. Just go ahead and accept them and work through the problem together. Involve those individuals in other tasks, simpler ones, that can help occupy their mind and body, if indeed that's a relevant consideration at the time, but to keep them from thinking or obsessing about whatever's scaring them. Don't scold them, and comfort them, and be encouraging. So the fundamentals of search and rescue has a nice little saying that they like to talk about for the mental steps of managing an emergency, and that's the STOP philosophy. S, stay, stop. Don't rush around, which causes confusion. Stopping helps fight panic. So that's the first step. Stop. Think. Think about the immediate and future dangers. Analyze the weather, the terrain, the available resources. Look for landmarks. How long ago did you know where you were? These are all things to do, of course, if you're lost. Observe. Look for immediate hazards. How long until dark? Those kinds of things. And then plan. Plan before acting. Be deliberate and practical. If you are lost, there's a series of recommendations for how to go about resolving that situation. Don't panic. Don't let fear get a hold of you. Follow the STOP procedure that we just discussed. Stop, stay stop, think, observe, and plan. Get oriented and mark your point zero. Stay put, much like our Hug a Tree program for small children. If lost, it makes sense to stay put for us as adults as well. Signal your location. Build a shelter. Scout immediate area. Find a source of water, because again, water is more important than food, and then find food.
A key to any kind of wilderness training, whether lost or on a search and rescue, is the skill of improvisation. So notice a broken arm wrapped in a magazine here, what looks like an earring or possibly a fishhook. There are 6 steps to improvisation that are important. Size up the situation, identify contingencies, so what can be worked with. Is there something to improvise? How bad are things going to get? Determine your goal, inventory your resources, build a plan, and take action. You may find that you need to improvise high priority needs. That could include first aid materials, like this here, clothing and shelter, fire starting materials, signaling materials, and water procurement materials. Now, ideally, if you have your pack all set up, much of this would be in the pack. But if you find yourself without these things, learning to improvise is an important skill. Shelter. Anything that protects the body from temperature, weather, insects, or other life-threatening elements can be defined as shelter. In an emergency, try to find shelter as soon as possible. Consider in this process location, away from hazards, near materials, insulation. So again, remember conductive heat loss. You want to make sure that there's an insulation between you and the ground to help keep you warmer. A heat source, if possible, so whether that's by fire or other bodies. And then whether or not this is a personal or a group shelter. So 3 types of shelters that are talked about in the fundamentals of search and rescue. The first is the immediate action shelter, protecting you within minutes. So notice how this person up here in the corner in the red plastic cover has allowed themselves to become warm, but it's just for themselves, and it's an immediate thing. A second would be a temporary shelter, like this middle picture, that's built with some sticks and tarp, and it can be put together pretty quickly, but is not designed for long-term use. And one can hope that building a hut like this never occurs out in the wilderness for any of us, but this would be the long-term shelter, designed and built for 72 hours or more. When you think about building shelters, be prepared with rainproof materials if at all possible. Nature isn't waterproof, so think about how to best waterproof it for yourself. Expend minimal energy in building the shelter, especially if you think that you might be lost for a while. Practice and perfect your shelter building skills beforehand, not when you need them. And again, review how to build shelters in a little bit more detail than what we're providing here. Fire. Before automatically building a fire, consider if it's necessary. It can be hard to make and maintain in a wet rainforest. It may expend a lot of energy, therefore, so think about its potential use. However, fire can be a good way of signaling your location, and so at that level, fire could be useful. A fire starting kit can make all of this easier, so consider having that with you. Make sure you can start a fire with your fire starting kit before you venture out into the wilderness. If you need to signal for help, some few things that you can think about. According to fundamentals of search and rescue, most successful rescues and or recoveries are a result of individuals who are able to assist in their own rescue by getting the attention of someone who can help. The sooner you effectively signal, the sooner you'll receive assistance. Electronic signals can be the most reliable. So if you have a personal locator beacon, for example, that you can carry with you at all times, that would be the most useful. But if you don't have that, then there are a variety of other signals that you can use. These are listed here. According to the fundamentals of search and rescue, the following signals are recommended for use by SAR personnel. Fire, so smoke and light, both can be useful in trying to generate attention. A mirror, preferably glass, not metal. A loud whistle. or colored signaling panels, white clothing, for example, or bright orange yellow, things that stand out in the environment you find yourself in. You should have these signals ready at any point for immediate use. And if you are trying to write something on the ground, a 6-to-1 ratio for letters or marks would be recommended. For example, a 3-foot wide, 18-foot long letter or mark for somebody to see. Interestingly, if you have cloudy conditions, trying to generate a black smoke would make sense, whereas in other cases, it might be better to have a different color smoke. Straight lines and right angles can attract attention, so try to consider how you could do those. And if you can move, especially if you can move with one of the colored panels, even better. All things considered, the more you know about nature, the better you'll be able to survive in the outdoors. Having a fundamental knowledge of edible plants, for example, and how to procure water in the wilderness are incredibly good skills to have. For even the recreational wilderness skills practitioner, a basic knowledge of the natural sciences, botany, ecology, geology, can be very useful and enriching. And if you would like to attend volunteer trips to learn more about ecology and forest of Hawaii, there are lots of opportunities around. Let's move on to part 3, wilderness safety. In this section, we'll discuss some of the basic issues of wilderness safety that builds on those that we've already discussed, specifically touching on the clothing useful for search and rescue. And this is really chapter 7 of Fundamentals of Search and Rescue, and other considerations related to hazards to consider. Clothing for SAR. Let's talk about why cotton kills to start. This is both a SAR mantra that you can find in the Fundamentals of Search and Rescue and a mountaineering mantra. So while cotton is a useful fabric, and you can see at least in this photo that most people are wearing it, and certainly in Hawaii, again, we don't have to worry as much about hypothermia as other places, one of the things cotton's really good at doing is absorbing water and staying wet. And so the more cold the environment, the less likely it is for cotton to be an adequate clothing choice, because if you get wet, either from sweat or from rain, it won't dry easily, and it holds not only the moisture in, but it doesn't retain any insulating heat. So cotton generally is not the thing to wear if you think you're going to encounter poor conditions. It can be really nice on a hot day or a nice day, but if it gets wet and you get cold, there's little in the way of insulation that it can provide. Materials to consider instead of cotton: wool, which retains water but stays warm, and so oftentimes smart wool socks, for example, might be the way to go. Silk is a lightweight undergarment version and transports moisture away from the skin, so it can be a useful kind of garment. Down is also not good when wet, but it can be excellent warming if it's dry. And of course, there are numerous types of synthetic fibers on the market designed to be quick drying, to be wicking, and to be strong. So consider having these types of clothes ready to go. In Hawaii, the biggest hazards for us are to protect against sun exposure and rain. Sometimes also vegetation, especially if the trails aren't maintained well. So for Hawaii, it's useful to have long pants and a long shirt, mostly to keep the sun off of you and to keep your legs from getting scratched up, even though it's often hot. I would also recommend, and as does SAR, that you consider layering. And we talked about this a little bit earlier when we talked about how to regulate cold temperatures. This can be a key to success as you have to take layers off or put layers on. This would include the layers: an underneath layer, a wicking layer, a clothing layer, an insulation layer, and a shell layer. Though in Hawaii, you probably wouldn't need all of those at any given time. In terms of footwear, footwear is a personal choice. For the most part, you should look for solid above the ankle boots or approach shoes that may not go above the ankle but are very solid and provide good grip. Hiking shoes rather than other athletic footwear is prioritized because of the way in which the treads are made. If you're buying hiking spikes, which is highly recommended here, you would definitely need to get some kind of solid boot because the spikes don't work really well on lighter shoes like tennis shoes. Additionally, you may consider getting gaiters. Many people use these in Hawaii to avoid unnecessary scratching from the underbrush, while also being able to wear shorts. Hawaii offers some unique issues in terms of terrain. Our terrain looks a lot different from other places in the continental US, and so experience and knowledge of how the terrain works here is pretty important. There are a variety of different specialized rescue environments that we could cover in our trainings, and that the Search and Rescue Fundamentals book does cover. We will be covering in different trainings throughout the year, high and low angle rescue environments, in part because these are fairly significant to the kind of terrain Hawaii has. In the next few slides, we'll talk a little bit about these issues in relation to Hawaii, and specifically what our terrain means in terms of rescues and appropriate work. In Hawaii, hanging valleys are fairly common. Getting stuck on a ledge is sometimes a cause of becoming lost in the wilderness in Hawaii. And oftentimes, some of those helicopters that we see going in and out of the valleys on the weekends are going to get people who have done just that. Other kinds of areas, not that we'll necessarily have to deal with them much on Oahu, but that can be of significance, include lava flows. So when operating in recent lava flow areas, exercise extreme caution. I know someone who broke her leg by punching through a more recent lava flow, and that can be very, very painful. Lava tubes, again, maybe not such a big issue here, primarily on the Big Island, and would require its own kind of rescue technique. Here, of course, aside from the hanging valleys and the steep inclines of the mountains, being cautious walking over rocky shorelines where waves might break over the rocks is an important consideration for us. The geology of Hawaii is volcanic and therefore crumbly. The narrow canyons and valleys of Hawaii make rock slides and falling rocks a serious hazard. I'm sure many of you have walked down one of these narrow valleys and seen giant boulders, sometimes that weren't there before, sometimes that weren't there the week before. And so always being prepared and aware of the kind of potential rockfall is important. If you are climbing on this kind of material, test your hand and footholds. Try to always retain solid connection to more than one point of protection. Try not to stand close to cliff edges. Think of them like the snow cornices where there might not be anything underneath them. And many of us have probably punched through the trail thinking it was solid when in fact it wasn't. So consider this when hiking on any of the trails in Hawaii. Rivers and streams on Oahu are relatively small and slow moving normally. However, we're all aware of the conditions of flash flooding that can happen, and that it's significant and important to make sure that you don't cross one of these bodies of water during a flash flood. You should wait it out. And this is advice to give to anyone that you see. Wait it out. Don't cross the river if it's above your waist, and certainly pay attention to how fast it's moving and if it's possible that you can do some kinds of things to mitigate the issues. If you have to cross a wide river that's not flash flooding, remember these tips. Don't cross if more than thigh deep. Leave your shoes on. That makes sense. Use a large stick for balance. If you're crossing, go as a team, not individually, using the group eddy method, which is right here. So there's one person and then they create their own eddy system. Start upstream from where you intend to leave and gauge that river before crossing. Any water-related rescue, of which we probably won't do any, but any water-related rescue requires good judgment, strong swimming capability, and knowledge of all types of technical systems and equipment used in climbing, and a thorough understanding of river dynamics and hydraulic influences, according to the fundamentals of search and rescue. SAR personnel without specialized training who come across moving water during a search should note or confirm the location on the map, be careful not to approach too closely, and make sure to mention the water during the debriefing. Do not attempt to cross moving water deeper than mid-thigh or moving very fast. Related to water are water-transmitted diseases. The water in Hawaii is sadly contaminated by the feces of rodents, pigs, and humans. It's easiest, therefore, to bring water with you on any mission. And again, water not just for you, but for others. If you drink collected water, always follow the process of filtering or treating and boiling it. Leptospirosis can enter also through open cuts, so perhaps talk to your physician about prevention medication. Another hazard that one might experience in the Hawaii forests are related to trees and brush. Falling trees, branches, debris is something to consider, as are exciting things like coconuts. So in the wilderness, especially where there's high winds, these things can break off and potentially fall on hikers at any time. Another issue for Hawaii that you may not find in other parts are the drop-offs. And I think this picture is supposed to show it, but I'm guessing most of us have had a foot punch through the side because we thought that the fern was part of the trail, but it really wasn't. While not a very common hazard, another hazard that can be one to consider here is lightning. Lightning is random, and you can never be guaranteed to be safe from it. Some places are safer than others, and so to avoid being struck, you should avoid being near high places and open fields, isolated trees, picnic shelters, etc., and instead try to stay relatively low lying. Again, it's not a significant issue in Hawaii, but lightning storms do happen. So this concludes our PowerPoint on fitness, survival, and safety. There's an online test that will be on the OSAR website, so stay tuned for that. We'll go over some of the basics that were covered here. But in the end, stay fit, stay safe, and I'll look forward to seeing you on our next field training.